Another reason is for avoiding close genetic relatives as mates, whose existence does not matter to me. Who can I go after today? Belong in our moral discourse and does it belong in the law?
How are you, Professor Lieberman?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for your time. Today I will talk to Professor Debra Lieberman. She is evolutionary psychologist and her main work is kin detection, disgust, and cooperation. We will try to understand how our ancient minds still govern modern relationship through the lens kin detection. First question to you is, what is this kinship? Is it purely
What is kinship?
biological?
No, that's a good question. And so I would say there's probably a lot of answers to that. Let me tell you how I answer that question, given what I've been researching. So I'm an evolutionary psychologist. I'm very interested in the software that evolved to guide social interactions. And so I'm very interested in, I call them mental apps. And certainly one of the behaviors that you see in humans is a propensity to be nice to kin, to be very nice to close genetic relatives. And so I've been very curious over the course of my career is how is it that we come to figure out who our close genetic relatives are? It seems like a very simple question. You just know. Someone tells you, be nice to your sister, or, that's your brother. And so it seems as if we would just use language as an easy marker of understanding and categorizing the world according to genetic relatedness. But it ends up that language couldn't be the way that we do it. I mean, it could be, but it's probably not for a few reasons. First off, it's very ancient. So other animals who don't have language are capable of understanding who their close genetic relatives are. And there's good reason for this. So evolution would have built into our psychology systems for recognizing and discriminating kin, by which I mean close genetic relatives, from non-close genetic relatives, for at least two reasons. First, for the reason of altruism. Systems that promote cooperation evolved to track individuals who tend to share the same programs for cooperation. So we contain design features that are nice to people who have a better probability of containing those same design features. So by virtue of the fact of sharing common descent, two siblings are far more likely to share similar genetics than any two people in the population plucked at random. And as you move outward on the family tree, that probability decreases. And so that's why one of these very powerful forms of cooperation evolved towards family members, why we have the saying, blood is thicker than water. It's because our mind tracks who has a good probability of being a close genetic relative and sharing the underlying system for cooperation. And so that would be one reason why other social animals also would have this kin detection. But another reason is for avoiding close genetic relatives as mates. And so without getting too crazy here, the idea that inbreeding avoidance is something that is pervasive in all species in which sexually mature individuals would encounter one another regularly. The reason why we have inbreeding avoidance systems, as do other species, is because mating with a close genetic relative tends to produce offspring that are far less healthy. And so it's the whole reason why sexual reproduction evolved in the first place, was to mix genes because of the benefits of fighting against disease-causing organisms. And it ends up that mating with a close genetic relative is more like cloning, right? So if you just clone yourself, all the disease-causing organisms that are in you, the pathogens and bacteria and viruses and all the other things that can cause us harm, if we just were to clone, it would mean that those disease-causing organisms would be really well adapted to the next generation, your offspring, and be able to wreak havoc in that biochemical environment. And so sexual reproduction evolved to introduce genetic variability at the level of pathogen avoidance. So we all share the same functions, but we have very different genes or different alleles that actually code for that same functionality. But in any case, inbreeding actually is closer to cloning and making yourself an identical twin than sexual reproduction. And this is why we detect kin. So we're not walking around looking at our relatives going, ooh, gross all the time. We're not kind of having that inbreeding avoidance reaction. But from time to time, if a genetic relative does make a sexual advance, we do have a very strong barrier aversion to engaging in sexual acts with close genetic relative. It's not a perfect system, and it does typically occurs when there's uncertainty in genetic relatedness, or obviously when there's drugs or alcohol that can impair a lot of the ways that we evaluate costs of doing things and other conditions. But so for those two reasons, altruism and mate choice, we expect to see in humans an ability to figure out who counts as a close genetic relative, this kin detection. So when I talk about kinship, I'm talking about close genetic relatives, individuals who share genes by virtue of common descent, not necessarily just kin in name, but because that would have been an important thing to distinguish over evolutionary history, people who were named kin terms versus people who are in fact kin.
So let's say kids are growing up in the same household, but there are many cases they separated after birth. They don't know who their kin is. This identification process, is it a lifelong process or it's just concentrated early? And is it a nature nurture element into it?
So let me take on the nature nurture aspect of it first. So as an evolutionary psychologist, when I think about nature and nurture, the distinction between is it genes or is it environment, it falls away. And the reason is because that is the domain of behavioral genetics. And behavioral genetics is a discipline that's basically asking to what extent are differences between these two groups, differences due to differences between their genes versus their environment. It's a group level variance question. As an evolutionary psychologist, we're talking about things that are universal design features that are in all humans that somehow, yes, have to have some type of genetic basis, right? But then at every step of the way during development have to interact with a cellular environment, tissue environment, biochemical environment, right? And then you get into the physical, the social, the ecological, the biological environment. So genes are just genes in a petri dish in the nucleus of a cell just hanging out. And so their expression relies, of course, on every aspect of the environment. So nature, nurture, to me, the answer is always both. But the question then becomes, okay, given that it's anything that's typically developing in humans is relying on some, foundation, some genetic basis that it's hooking into in order to operate in some way. The question then becomes, how is it that we're detecting kin? So arguably you could say, sure, on chromosome such and such, there's a stretch of DNA that codes for this algorithm that causes what, right? And so that's the question. What does it cause? And it seems that the information processing, the engineering aspect of this, it depends on which type of close genetic relative you're talking about. So when I first started, I was interested in siblings. How do siblings come to understand? How do people detect who their siblings are? And if you go back to ancestral hunter-gatherer conditions, ask the question, what cues would have been available? What information would have been available in the environment that would have allowed people to infer that another individual is likely a close genetic relative? And it seems for siblings that there's two pieces of information. And so this is going to get to your question about whether things are early developing or later developing. So one piece of information, which is really fantastic, is to the extent that you have correctly identified your mother. And ancestrally, over evolutionary time, people would have been pretty good at identifying which woman out there in the world would have been, classified and categorized as mom. It's the one who was breastfeeding you for years, right? So that would have been typical of mammals. And so we have a great cue as to who my mom is. Now, any other infant that she nurses, that she births and then nurses, has a really good probability of being a sibling. And so if I'm already alive and walking around the environment and I see my mom pregnant and give birth and now nursing and caring for intensively a newborn, I can make the inference that's my sibling. It's not done consciously. I mean, yes, we can put a label to it and linguistically mark it, but the systems that are tracking for kinship are pretty much just picking up information from the social environment all the time. And so observing your mom breastfeeding and caring for an infant, you're not thinking, oh, heck, that's my sibling. You're like, oh, my mom's breastfeeding an infant. But your brain is picking up and doing something with that information, saying, aha, inference, that's likely akin. So for that young infant, we can kind of ratchet up the dial on our likelihood and our estimate of relatedness. But that cue, there's two things to mention about that cue. First off, it doesn't matter whether I'm 3, 10, 15, 20. If I see my mom birthing and caring for an infant, with good probability, a sibling. And so that information out there in the world, that cue set, mom with infant, is stable enough that it doesn't matter how old I am. So it's not during development necessarily from that angle. But now the question becomes, okay, that's the older sibling. Older siblings are privileged in the sense that they have access to that cue. But what about the younger sibling? What about the younger sibling who is the one being breastfed and nursed for a long period of time? They weren't around to see their mom pregnant and then nursing their older siblings. So how do younger siblings figure out who counts as an older sibling? And that also comes down to tracking who their mom and their dad invest in. It's all about parental investment. And so, whereas the older sibling can look at maternal investments in this infant, that's such a potent cue. You need to see it only for a little bit of time, and you're like, certainty of kinship is quite high. But as a newborn looking around the world, you're like, who of all these kids could potentially be a sibling? In ancestral environments, kids were running around all over the place, probably related to many people in the tribe, right? And so the question is, how are you carving the line between close genetic nuclear family members and more distant relatives? And that would have been really important from an evolutionary point of view for the benefits of altruism, but also for the costs of inbreeding. So knowing who your siblings actually were, not just of the random kids, was a really important decision. And so it looks like younger kids, what they're doing is they're tracking, it's been called co-residence duration with their older siblings. What I think is a more exact way of describing that is periods of shared codependency. So they are in the house together being cared for by the same two parents. So who else is getting fed by my mom? Who else is being cared and tended to when they're ill, right? Who's being yelled at, right? Where are they sleeping at night? Who are they coming to when they're in trouble, when they're hurt? And so tracking that over a long period of time throughout the period of childhood seems to be the way that younger kids figure out who counts as an older sibling. With additional information over the years, our brain very slowly ratchets up. This is probably that's probably a sibling. Oh, they ate with it. They're always here. They're being yelled at. And it's like, because remember, in ancestral environments, everyone kind of looks the same, right? There's no family resemblance, tribe resemblance, right? So the idea that people are saying, hey, you seem to look facially more like, no. Ancestrally, there was none of that. Everyone looked pretty much the same. And the variations in these features wouldn't have correlated as tightly as would have been required given the problems of altruism and inbreeding avoidance. Rather, better to look at who is engaging in behavior to care for another individual, because that's going to provide better information. Who's motivated to tend and care for the welfare of another person? So younger siblings are using this cue throughout development. Older children are just using it, their information about their mom caring for a younger sibling when available. But those cues predict how altruistic siblings are to one another and how grossed out they are to one another when they think about sexual behavior. Now, what's interesting about what you asked is, are there things that are more concentrated early on during childhood? So now you could see why the answer, it depends. Are you the younger child, and are you starting to map your social world, right after birth and trying to figure out who else is around, who's getting care from my mom and so forth, who's trying to push me out of the crib, what sibling rivalry, who's coming after me to kind of take me out as a competitor for a sibling. So that's just for siblings. But now the question is, how do moms figure out who their offspring are? How do fathers infer relatedness to their offspring? And how do kids figure out who their fathers are? And so each of these things has a dedicated time window and set of cues that are going to be diagnostic of who counts as a particular type of relative. So moms have an unmistakable cue of relatedness to their offspring. It falls right out of them. So there you go. And so birth is the cue. But fathers, that can't be their cue, right? Doesn't fall out of them. And so, we have a saying, mommy's baby, daddy's maybe. And so the idea, how do fathers figure out paternity? And so there's been a lot of answers floated. Some researchers think that it is about resemblance, how much they facially or behaviorally resemble one another. It could be. I'm not a large fan of that hypothesis. I'm not ready to say that I think it's 100% wrong. I have a better pathway, set of hypotheses that I think is probably closer to what's actually happening, which is this. Just like older siblings in the environment can use this fantastic cue of seeing their mom care for an infant, there's a very tight association between mom and newborn. That's a linkage, that's a guide rail that can then allow other individuals in the community to infer relatedness. It's like a scaffolding structure that you can now build off of that, who else is related. Given the high degree of certainty between mom and offspring, now other children of that mom can infer siblingship. But now other men who have had sex with that woman can start to identify whether or not they're the father, right, of that baby. So they can link baby to mom. And the question now is, can you link man to mom? Right? So there's a couple of steps there. But that to me seems to be the inferential process and steps that men are likely probably taking. So did I have sex with this woman? Not, she just had a baby. Did I have sex with her? Did I have sex with her 10 years ago, 10 days ago, or, 10 months ago? And so that's the question. And so men are probably very sensitive to that. Yeah.
Or in some cases, maybe some accident or something happens. So maybe mom's sister's kids are also in that same infant stage and she is also looking after them. So that also kind of comes under the kinship.
It does. And so it's a really good question. So alloparenting, the idea that as hunter-gatherers, we would have helped out. We would have been, cooperatively engaged with people who also had offspring. I'm going to watch your kids, you're going to watch mine. I might even breastfeed, a nephew or a niece and so forth. And so, however, that said, so as much as there's good evidence for cooperative breeding, infants would have still spent the majority of time with mom. When sick, when ill, when colicky, aunt gives the baby right back and says, here, back to you. And so it's time to feed, right? So I do believe that there was likely a lot of cooperation between women in terms of childcare. But the majority of the time, it is the mom wanting and motivated to make sure that the baby is okay, right? Other people were there to give her a break, to be sure, but other people gave the baby right back, right? So the baby was typically with mom. So it's about the reliability of the cue. And so the more frequent the duration, I would argue that there's a longer duration of mom-infant associations than infant other non-parent associations. And so that I still believe it's a very reliable cue. But think about it this way. A really poor engineering design. So if you're writing code to get AI to start recognizing its offspring and so forth, but in humans, a really bad piece of code would be in a male. Any child your mate picks up is your own. That's a bad design feature. So a male's going to invest his time and energy now raising any child at all that he sees his mate come into contact with once. That's a poor design. That would have been selected out very quickly. Instead, men, I think, are very, very attuned to which child is my mate investing in and what is my certainty of paternity. What is the information that she's been faithful, that she's been with other males, I had sex with her about the right time. None of this has to be conscious. It's just a matter, it could just gurgle up into a feeling. Well, it might even be a feeling I don't even have a word for, being a female, but this feeling of, yeah, like, aha, like validation, verification, like certainty, paternity certainty. But there needs to be, I'm sure there's some type of feeling or emotion that goes along with that.
Is it patriarchal?
What do you mean, is it patriarchal? What's the
Like
it?
there is a patriarchal angle to it because we evolutionarily gatherer and provider, and this is my kid, this is my offspring. So that mindset is coming from that patriarchy or not like that?
I don't know whether the word patriarchy is appropriate here because there's a matriarchy because moms are saying this is my child and I've birthed it and I am feeding it and I am also
Okay.
making sure that I'm gathering berries for it, and so there could be an equal statement about a matriarchy as well. So I'm not quite sure that that is the best introduction of the patriarchy in that kinship dynamic there, especially because, well, here's an interesting aspect of it. I don't know that this has to do with the patriarchy as it's typically discussed in quotes, but because men are less certain of their paternity by nature, the idea that it's on their mind more, that it's a concept and it's a set of ideas that's top of mind far more frequently than women have appreciate, for instance. So women never have to worry about the problem. Let me give you a different example. So women don't have to have the problem of maternity certainty. So it's like, I don't get it. Like, I understand, like, I know if it's your baby or not. Like, probably I know, right? But the idea of being, in consternation of, whether or not this is my baby, that's a foreign idea. I appreciate the problem, but it's not something I feel in the depths of my soul. Men do. But think of a problem that women feel that men tend not to. Men tend not to walk around. So I want to talk about ancestrally. So females are, pound for pound, muscle per muscle fiber, far less physically formidable. The average female ancestrally would have been just physically less capable than the average male. I don't think I'm saying anything that is not true. I'm sure it's going to bug some people, but here you go. But however, in the same way that females are very blind to the fact that, this idea of ambiguity over, maternity and so forth, men are very blind to the fact that women walk around very concerned about the threat that men pose. And so to them, men just think, oh, they're, what threat? Females are walking around, maybe not explicitly, not consciously, it's not necessarily being discussed, but there's very much an undertone of, I'm really happy to be living in a police state right now, where I'm actually protected by social norms, by and large. There's still crazy people and dangerous personalities out there, but by and large, I'm pretty protected. So evolutionary psychologists have been very fond of saying following, which is that males might be afraid that women are going to laugh at them, right? But females are afraid men are going to kill them. And so that's a big asymmetry, and one that I don't think that men often appreciate, the fact that part of female psychology is navigating the dangers of formidable men. Let's just leave it at that. And so females also have an evolved strategy to navigate that in the same way that males have an interesting psychology of figuring out their paternity. So the sexes do differ in the sense of having different types of adaptive problems when it comes to survival and, in this case, kinship.
So let's say in childhood, we interact
Mm.
immediate outer layer of our family or immediate layer or just outer layer. When this outside of kinship, this trust, friendship, identity, these things form, is it a same spectrum of kinship type of mentality or something else?
I think it's something else. It's a very interesting question because now you're talking about how do other forms of cooperation evolve and develop over the course of the lifetime. So we've been talking about a special case of cooperation between kin, right? So we can talk about individuals recognize kin, and then we're nice to kin as a function of their degree of relatedness. Other animals are very similar. But what's interesting about humans is we form friends, and friendship can transcend kinship. You can form friendships that even are more valuable, more close, and that you kind of care even more about friends who are genetically unrelated. How can this happen? Is it taking advantage of and parasitizing the kinship system? The answer is no. The other route to close relationships is through the avenue of, so this is the evolution of friendships. And the evolution of friendships is based on the fact that out there in the world, it would have been really nice. So the world is dangerous. Sometimes you go hungry, sometimes you're thirsty, you need help, you've been sick, you haven't maybe brought food back from the hunt. Maybe you are the target of a social antagonist. Their life had a lot of ups and downs as hunter-gatherers. Having people who cared about your welfare beyond genetic relatives, beyond family, could have meant the difference between life or death. And the question then is, How is it that you are going to get someone, take a good stake in your welfare, to want to see you back to health, to want to help you when you're being targeted by a social antagonist, who's going to want to feed you or help care for your baby? How do you do that? And so this is all based on cultivating value, cultivating irreplaceability. The idea that to the extent that you find me valuable and irreplaceable by virtue of the things that I do, you're going to want to aid me and help me to continue me being healthy enough to deliver those benefits that you found so valuable. And so this type of psychology exists because other people, by virtue of not being clones, everyone differs. Everyone does different kinds of things. The things that I do as I go about my day, some of the things might benefit you. Some of the things have no bearing on your health or your fitness or your existence. Some things might actually be a net cost, right? So if I'm, walking down the road and peeling my banana and, I'm walking in front of your place and I just chuck my peel and don't throw it away, like that's just that I'm happy. I'm eating my banana and walking along. But I've just littered on your property, right? That's a cost to you. Now, if I've just littered on a neighbor that you don't like and you're looking out your window and you're like, ha ha, you might like me, right? So it depends. No act is in and of itself good and bad, or good or bad. It's all about the perceiver here. But the point is this: other people engage in behaviors all day long, some of which benefit you, most of it has no effect on you, and some of it is actually really costly, right? Someone cuts you off, doesn't hold the door, they smell, they cough on you, they sneeze on you. Like these are things that are potentially really bad. Contrast that with someone who's making your favorite meal, someone who's really attractive, someone who is giving out, lollipops, someone who is doing the things that you enjoy doing, transforming the world in a way that's similar to your preferences. So how do we act? So that's an actual way to jumpstart these types of friendships. When you meet someone and they're wearing a shirt of your favorite band, or they're eating your favorite meal, or they're reading your favorite book, or they're doing something that overlaps, that's a preference. That's an opening to basically say, hey, I love them too. That's a great band. Oh my God, that's my favorite meal. Have you ever tried it over here? There's a way for us to communicate. All of that is the theater of communicating value. And we do it in so many different ways. But it's basically casting a line out, and it's the same line. It's basically going fishing and saying, hey, I find what you do to be a sort of benefit in the sense of, it matches my preference. And basically you're listening then for what happens next. If the person looks up and says nothing, just looks at you, that tells you probably not, probably move on, right? Leave them alone. Or if they're like, oh yeah, it's great. Like I have a little left over, or, did you read this part of the book? Or, oh my gosh, did you try this? Like if someone engages and kind of volleys back, that's a really interesting signal to our brain. This person might value you back and might be a good candidate for a potential friend, right? Someone who you might snowball into a relationship of mutual valuation. If I value you and you value me, I'm going to value you because you value me. Because having someone who was there for you ancestrally would have been really important. And so it doesn't matter why anyone values you, to the extent that someone wants to see you around and in good health, doing the kinds of things that you naturally like to do. My goodness, that's, it's win-win. And so that's how friendships start. It's very interesting. When I teach a class on evolutionary psychology, and I ask my students in the class, like, why do you like your friend? What is it about your friend that you like? And it would seem we spend so much time talking about friendships and trying to be valuable to other people that it's amazing how hard it is to characterize why it is you like your friends, or what it is they like about you. I don't know. We hang out. We talk, we like the same things. They get me, it's always these kind of very interesting things, but it's very specific to the person, right? It's always very specific to the person. And that's the answer, the idea that there's overlap, very specific overlap. And being replaced is something that's awful, right? So you have a best friend and they meet someone else who kind of, if I like going to the movies with my girlfriend and suddenly she meets someone else who also likes going to the movies, I'm going to feel a little bit jealous, like I'm being replaced, for the thing that I thought I delivered the benefit as the person who like enjoyed and joined her on these movie outings. And so if she finds someone else, that's going to be a signal that I'm potentially being replaced. And that to our ancestral mind is very dangerous. And so there's strategies for, some positive strategies, some not so positive strategies for ensuring that you retain that friendship and do away with any competitors. And so, but friendships really do rely on these two things: identifying in other people their affordances, their portfolio of benefits or costs or things that they do that you find of benefit. And when we look out into the world, you don't need to know someone for very long to have a very first impression of their portfolio. Like, oh, I didn't like the looks of them. Or, oh, wow, did you see that? Like, and so you can, people are very quick to kind of assess another person's portfolio. So in addition to looking at those kinds of things, we also are very sensitive to how they regard us. Do they value our welfare? Because just one isn't enough. A close relationship is, I like your portfolio. On average, all the things that you do tend to be beneficial, specifically your love of evolutionary psychology and the fact that you like to go boating too, or something. And so, but also I sense that you enjoy my company for whatever it is you seem to think I deliver to the equation, which I'll very happily continue to do. But those two components are really important. And when you start thinking about it, now we can layer that onto the kinship system. And it starts to explain why it is we might like some relatives more than others. So if you have a very big family and a lot of siblings, you might have, let's just for argument's sake say, you have a similar degree of certainty. I should say your system that's assessing kinship has a very similar degree of certainty. In fact, let's make all of your siblings younger siblings. Your mom, birthed them and cared for them. Your brain says, aha, they are siblings and they're all the same level of relatedness to me. But now some of them just share preferences and desires and goals a little bit more. They overlap a little bit more with you, which is going to make you like one of them slightly more, right? So I'm sorry to be saying this. I know it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable, but the idea you might like a certain sibling more than another sibling. And, so I guess what I want to do is remove people's guilt for ever feeling differently about each of their siblings. Their kinship system might have fired exactly similarly across all of them, but the idea that the overlap provides additional routes to extending the relationship into this, this realm of extra value and so forth. But even if you were to scrape away all the portfolio, right, or how much they seem to care about you, so deep is this kinship system that it will withstand many costs to ensure that you continue the bonds with your close genetic relatives. It's very hard to cut a tie with a family member. Not impossible, but it is very difficult to do so. You're there, and for good reason. Evolution made it a little bit difficult. It shouldn't just be a hot and cold sort of on-off switch. It's probably very difficult to, but with good reason, with additional costs over the years, it is something that can be done. So kinship system, but then this kind of association and valuation system that's layered on top. And that's equally important and part of what makes us humans. Like we're always trying to cultivate value. Look at me, look at all the things I can do. And that's all what social media is about, right?
Now, as you mentioned all these things, another thing also kind of developed within us, and you really worked hard on it, which is disgust.
Mhm.
Now, how trustworthy that emotion is, and because of it, we slowly become choosy, likes, dislike happens, or what kind of emotion is disgust? Please talk about that.
Sure. So disgust is a really interesting emotion. I do study gratitude too, so not only the kind of more negative emotions, but so disgust is interesting. It seems to have evolved to do at least three things, but let's just say three for right now. So it regulates what we eat. It evolved to detect cues of disease-causing organisms, pathogens. So you see, mold or like something crazy growing out of your food, or you smell something. Typically, what we're picking up on are cues to toxins and microorganisms and things. So bitter and sour taste buds also do that as well. Disgust is primarily a system that evolved to help us navigate what to consume, make good decisions about food. So disgust is very much tied to pathogens, disease-causing organisms. And so in addition to eating things, it also regulates what we touch, not touching things that are full of pathogens. So blood, guts, gore, feces, making sure that we steer clear of pathogens. The third domain is sex. And so disgust seems to also regulate our personal decisions about mates. We tend to find certain types of mates very attractive. But on the flip side of that, we also find certain individuals not very attractive, very aversive. And so disgust is the emotion that also regulates avoidance of certain people as sexual partners. And it seems like it might be a big jump from eating and touching to sex. But in fact, disgust was already involved in sexual reproduction, because in order to even get close to someone means that you have to somehow downregulate and dampen your level of disgust. Other people are planets of disease-causing organisms, right? So in order to come into contact with another person's, body fluids and saliva, you have to downregulate disgust. And in fact, sexual attraction, how sexually valuable you see someone, not just physical attraction, I'm talking about sexual attraction, seems to downregulate disgust. So the more sexually attractive you find someone, that's also, I think they're actually the same thing. It's just different words depending on, so the greater sexual attraction, the less disgust, the more disgust, the less sexual attraction. It's just kind of a gauge of how green the light is or how red the light is, keeping you from moving forward or moving back. And so because it's already associated with sex, you might imagine a very simple evolutionary refinement such that disgust already has to be lowered in order to engage in sex with some people, making it a very easy system to manipulate so that it fired and increased when someone was detected as an unsuitable mate. Disgust is the system that is activated when individuals are perceived as close genetic relatives, or very unhealthy, or just very sexually unattractive. And so that gets into the whole domain of mate choice in evolutionary psychology. But for now, let's just consider disgust as those three important domains. It regulates personal decisions about what to eat, what to touch, and who to have sex with. But you might be saying there seems to be more going on with disgust, which is absolutely true. So it looks like disgust, in addition to regulating your own decisions about your own behavior, about the things that, are beneficial to you, disgust also kind of jumps the fence into the social world and seems to also be deployed about other people. So what other people should be doing. And the question is, why is that? What's going on there? How does disgust extend beyond the individual to now enter into the fray of, social norms and morality? So the book that I wrote with my former graduate student and legal scholar, Carlton Patrick, he is together, we tried to figure this out. And here's the story in short. I know I could talk a lot, but here it is in short. And so to understand why disgust is applied in the social world, we have to take one step back, and which is the following: that males tend to, I'm trying to determine how far back to go. So males compete over resources. Males compete over resources for access to females. So the, animal kingdom wide, you have males who are fighting for territory, access to, food and land and water and all these other types of things in order to get the things that are going to make them more attractive so that females choose them to mate. And so hopefully that's not a complete out there kind of statement, but in biology, it tends to be that males tend to fight for and accrue resources, and females select males based on their ability to obtain and defend and allocate resources to them. And so given that that's the case, what's interesting is that our big jump from kind of dyadic interactions to group level interactions means that people can band together in order to increase the leverage and formidability of their coalition. And there's a psychology of defending resources and forming coalitions to defend resources that isn't only part of human nature, it's also non-human primate nature. So if you look at some of our chimp cousins, so Richard Wrangham, Jane Goodall, Michael Wilson, they've all published some really interesting studies. And one of the ones, so it's Richard Wrangham that I'm really talking about now, who has talked a lot about how chimps will patrol their territories. So chimps will actually create a little coalition and band together and start to patrol their boundaries. And it's not as much to protect what's within, of course it is, it's more to protect what's within by eliminating what's without. And so they will patrol the boundaries, and if they hear males on their little journey around their territory, they will get quiet, they will start to listen for how many males are present, and they will determine whether it pays to go and take them out and kill them. And so with playback studies where on a patrol you have researchers who are just kind of playing back pants and grunts of a lone male to a bunch of, 3 male chimps patrolling the boundaries or their borders, those 3 males will, rush the speaker, in an attempt to find that lone male to tear him to shreds. So men seem to have a coalitional psychology so not all men, but part of male psychology. I always get in trouble. So if you squint, you see male psychology looking as if it tends to have the feature where men tend to band together and form coalitions and identify groups of lower leveraged minority males. I don't mean minority in terms of skin color. I just mean minority in terms of leverage and formidability, because it ends up that being able to band together and take out other males meant that you were protecting the resources from the future when they could potentially band together and take yours. And so it is a get them before they get us mentality. Humans are very similar in many ways. We couch it in a lot of terms and we couch it in morality and so forth. But the idea is that males are doing this. Now, let's get back to disgust. What does this have to do with disgust? If I'm trying to defend resources and I'm forming a coalition, I'm defending my territory, I'm defending my resources, and I'm trying to get other people to do the same and get on board with my coalitional action to do that. And who am I going to go after? Who out there in the world is worth me going after? I don't want to go after kin. That would be silly, right? They're high on the totem pole. The question, who's low on the totem pole? Whose existence does not matter to me? If they were gone tomorrow, I wouldn't feel it. This is the politically incorrect part of the conversation, but this is part of our darker human psychology. So we have a sense of value of groups and individuals. And disgust is a system that just so happens to tag those types of behaviors that I don't like. These are the kinds of foods that I don't like. These are the kinds of things I don't like to touch. These are the kinds of people I don't like to have sex with. Right? And so these things cause me disgust. That's an internal marker of low value to me. And therefore, things and acts and people that, wouldn't necessarily be costly for me to support any type of alliance if it was going after that act, person, or whatever. So India, you have the untouchables, literally the untouchables, right? So the idea that there's a certain caste of individuals you don't even touch. But the notion of having disgust as an internal marker of the kinds of things. It's not one-to-one. It's not stewed tomatoes. If I find stewed tomatoes disgusting, I'm not going to go out and try and form a coalition let's get everyone who eats stewed tomatoes, right? So, however, in California, a bunch of people tried to get together and go after the people who ate foie gras. So that's the idea of there are politics around food. And it's interesting because it's one coalition with preferences that are trying to go after people with other preferences. And it's about which coalition is more formidable, has greater leverage, and can get the laws, written in order to impose costs on those other groups, right? So the cost would be, preventing them from eating the things that they like to eat or things that are local to their environment or things that they need. And so disgust is an internal marker that basically is an index of the kinds of things that are worth going after. And that enters into that is fed up, it's served up to the systems that are looking for and sifting around for who can I go after? who can I go after today? And so disgust is just one of those emotions that says, well, I don't like this, so that's a possibility. And so now I can take other people's temperature. So disgust also works in being, I find that disgusting, right? And so you say that in a crowd and you say, and you listen, who answers back? Yeah, me too, right? Let's get them, right? And so, but the idea of if you went to a particular location, you said that and there were crickets and no one said anything in return, you'd know you were in a bad situation. People disagree with you. So disgust can be a way to not only internally mark the kinds of behaviors and kind of moral projects that are worth backing, but then there's also, ways of expressing disgust to see who might agree with you if you ever want to start a campaign of any sort. Disgust also works as being a bit of a moral shield, right? So if now suddenly you're in the landscape where there's a coalition forming against something that you might value, right? Or a behavior that you enjoy, but you realizing that it's a formidable group that can impose massive costs on you and your family, then that's disgusting. That's not me. That's disgusting, right? So there's been cases in the States where you have politicians who are gay who come out railing against homosexuality. And the idea, well, why is that? So it's the idea of that their perception is that where they're from, it's something that would cost them dearly to come out as being gay. And so for them, disgust is one way to kind of shield them, to indicate that's not me. Take your sights off me, focus on someone else until they get caught. So the idea that, but the point is that disgust jumps this fence of personal decision making into the moral arena. And I think that you can see from the way I've talked about it, not in any good way, right? And so the question is does disgust belong in our moral discourse, and does it belong in the law? So Carlton and I in our book basically argued that we raised the question as to whether disgust is impartial, and the answer is no. It's always coming from someone's psychology, and it's always coming from a psychology interested in leveraging their power to go after a minority group. Again, not skin color, just minority in terms of social leverage and so forth. So that is the short, believe it or not, story of how disgust gets into morality.
Now, it makes really good sense because I read somewhere that Hitler was in mass killing mood because of disgust sensitivity to protect his clan from contamination. And what you were saying, it absolutely makes sense. I don't really care about that untouchable or
Yes.
small group.
No, for sure. Or he could just be a psychopath. Rules are different slightly for psychopaths, but yes, certainly use the campaign of disgust to circle the wagons around the Jews. And so I would say that disgust was very much part of Nazi Germany rhetoric, but also this bloodthirst as well. Hitler is a very interesting human when you think about the Aryan nation of blonde hair, blue-eyed, like he couldn't have been any more different. So there's an interesting psychology there.
So that means throughout the evolution, there are many cases we individually or collectively love something, hate something, disgust, keep our boundaries, etc. So I'm coming to this betrayal or these negative emotions we don't like, and extreme cases of fighting between clans and tribalism, if you like, because we have seen a lot of these kind of things, but still we get caught into wrong people, wrong group, wrong social alignment, etc. How you say that?
So a number of colleagues who are very interested in this question about this kind of coalitional aggression, so hatred, outrage, and how groups coalesce and the information they use as flashpoints in order to coordinate mentally. And anything can provide evidence so long as it is agreed upon, right? It doesn't have to bear the hallmarks of scientific anything. It just has to be something that is a coordinatable event, an interpretation of that event that people can use to solidify their own coalitions and get everyone mentally and physically coordinated. It's all for the purpose of mental and physical coordination, for the purpose of this kind of intergroup warfare. So, you could take us out of the jungles and into the cities. It's the same thing. Same psychology is operating in that sense. No, it's certainly very interesting. But if you have specific questions, I can try and answer those. But that's a lot of the work of my colleagues.
So we are almost the end of it. So the last question to you is, yes, as an individual, we have seen a lot of hatred, betrayal, friendship, and other emotional ups and downs, evolutionary and in our life. Whether we will reach at all an optimum point, or this circle or cycle of life will keep on going for forever.
What's the optimum? What do you consider the optimum?
Optimum means in my existence or individual's existence, all the happenings are soothing us rather than creating any discomfort within us psychologically.
That would be nice. So,
Yeah, maybe 100 years ago, we are really hopeless to identify who is trustworthy. And after 100 years or whatever, we are.
So in terms of being able to determine who's trustworthy, so narrowing in on that is that's a great topic. How do we identify good people from bad? And how can we do that so that we can protect our own well-being, our health, our future? That's a really important question. And so I've been working with former FBI agent Joe Navarro on some of these questions. And so he's a renowned behavioral analyst, and he's worked a lot on body language, nonverbal behavior, but also about language and so forth. And so he's got a great book, Dangerous Personalities, among the many books that he has written. But he talks about how dangerous personalities are out there, and these are really bad people who are motivated to exploit and scheme and lie and cheat and steal and devalue, ultimately for their own gain. And they do it intentionally, with awareness, without shame. There's no need to say, oh, these poor people, if only they could go to therapy, or if they were just, no, 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 no. So there's in my world, there's a very hard line. You're a good person, a cooperator, someone who can take feedback and repair, be accountable, grow and learn, become a better human towards this optimum, right? Optimal kind of existence, versus people who are constantly trying to knock you off your game and take you down the wrong roads and exploit. So to me, that is the question. And if you were to talk about in today's world where people are very concerned about AI, learning more about humans from humans and practicing and observing, knowing what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like to engage with these kinds of really bad personalities before it happens is actually going to help people, I think, live better, more fulfilling lives. I know it will, because they're all around. They're not just in the United States, as much as people might wish to say. They're not. And so they're all over the place, and they are present at a decent enough frequency that most people have at least one person in their life who is somewhere in the realm of, a narcissist, or hopefully not a social predator, but paranoid or emotionally unstable, and learning to know what that sounds like, what that looks like, and how to counter it and disengage is really critical. So that to me is, the future. So 100 years ago, I would say maybe there weren't as many of these people. Maybe that's a really good question, but they were still around. Our hunter-gatherers, our ancestors would have dealt with them at a lower frequency, perhaps, but they were still around because their behaviors rely on mental systems that can break down or be impaired, or just the natural variation that's going to occur when you have so many reproducing individuals producing variants and I call models of. There's going to be some that are just slightly off. Some are broken in certain ways, and so to me, understanding humans, the design of the mind, why it evolved, how it is our social psychology operates, and then how it can break down, not only leading to some of these negative things, but then all the things that lead us to, the path of flourishing. So to me, that's kind of the fun part of what I do, is educating people about our evolved psychology and the things to watch out for and the things to be proud of, and that hopefully can help people have a more fulfilling life.
So on that, thank you, Professor Lieberman, and hopefully we have another session sometimes down the line with some other topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.